Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Rashke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press. Our small press publishes books we want to see in the world, including Changing Paths by Yvonne Abreu, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison of New World Witchery podcast, and Verona Green, my latest book. Find out more about us and purchase these and other titles at thousandvoltpress.com. Melissa Madara is a witch, author, and educator. Their work deals with the healing power of myth, divination, and immersion in the natural world, rooted in building animist relationships with the living earth. They are a teacher at Catlin Books and numerous other metaphysical spaces, and their research is shared with the growing community of witches on the Moon Cult Patreon. Find their interviews in the New York Times, Vice, Broadly, Teen Vogue, or Refinery 29, or see Melissa's published work in Fiddler's Green, Benefica Magazine, or their two published books, The Witch's Feast, and coming in 2024, The Witch's Workshop. You can follow Melissa's work at www.mooncult.com, and that's cult with a B, or IG at St. Jane. Awesome. And we'll have links again for that in the show notes.
I could send those to you, yeah.
But Melissa Madara, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you on. I'm so excited to talk about your books and your work in general. But if you've listened to the podcast, you know, the first question we ask everybody, especially, you know, with IG and all of these things, why still write books?
I mean, books are such a cornerstone of the occult tradition. Why still write books makes a lot of sense, but like the larger publishing market where, you know, like paper trade books are falling, you know, by the wayside, bookstores are closing. But in the occult world, why write books? I mean, that's like so much of what we do. Books are integral to the transmission of information across ages, across centuries within the occult tradition. So to be a part of that and actively participating in that is a beautiful thing in its own. To be sharing witchcraft information in that sort of like historical manner, I think it's still something important that we do. I believe in, you know, sort of the magic of the hard copy.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're right. There's something just about, you know, so many of us are solitary creatures, not just solitary practitioners, that it's how we communicate with each other in kind of a strange way too. Like, you know, modern writers, like I think we inform each other's work and all of that.
Absolutely.
Kind of stuff.
Yeah. My friend Kim Schwenk is the book antiquarian at UC San Diego, or at least was for a period of time. And she's got a lot of wonderful writing about occult books as talismanic objects as well. She just did an awesome lecture at the Veritas Genii Symposium. I didn't get to catch it, but she was talking about like plant spirits informing the paper and the inks that make books, and books being this like spirited tradition of this animist relationship with the materials that go to create it, that then compounds to create a talismanic object that has intelligence, has spirit, and is something that has you know, ability to communicate in its own beyond just like what's written within the book. So when we look at books like through that lens within occult history and in the occult tradition, they're very, very cool and kind of like indispensable magical tech.
Well, I mean, I always think about like, you know, I've just so many lectures I've heard, especially Dr. Alexander Cummins talks about this a lot. That,
Al.
You know, that like, yeah, we love Al. You know, that, you know, even cutting people in like early modern England who couldn't read still had these books because the books were magical in and of themselves.
Absolutely. And that's where we think we find this obsession with collecting occult books too. And that, I mean, for as much as like regular publishing has kind of done away with the hard copy or has diminished the hard copy, I see none of that in the occult world. If anything, there's this interest in like special edition printings and like interesting limited number hardbacks, and the fanaticism around collecting these books, I think has a lot to do with that belief that just having it is participation within the magic, you know, itself before you even crack the cover.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I mean, based on the size of both my in physical TBR pile of occult books and my hoarding of electronic occult books.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, like I'll
Oh,
never get through them all, but there is something about just having access to them.
the hoarding is real. The hoarding is so real. And it is devastating to know that you're not ever going to be able to do it all. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? There'll always be witchcraft books I didn't read.
yeah,
Tragic. True.
yeah. I mean, I always like, very Scorpio, like morbidly say, when you die, your inbox will be full and your TBR pile will still exist. Like, there's just no way to get to the end of either one of those things. So,
Fair, fair.
I mean, it'd be nice if I could
Would.
just sit and read, but I also like to write. So,
True.
and so for you, like what sparked the writing for you? Like, did you always want to be a writer, or did this kind of come late for you?
I never really wanted to be a writer specifically, but I learned that it was something that I had, a gift for, something that I had a natural inclination for. And it was a great way for me to sort of engage with occult media, beyond teaching, beyond, being a
Mhm.
physical person in a physical store and all of that. It was a way to really reach people and in a way that was a lot more comfortable for me than, I guess, other options like being a social media personality. I'm not that guy. I don't really like having my face out there and stuff. But writing is a way to sort of like hide behind it a little bit, and allow just the voice to speak, which is very important for me. But when it came to the books, I was really lucky in that my publisher reached out to me initially. They had seen some interviews I had given about kitchen witchcraft for Vice years ago, and they got excited about that and reached out to me about the book. And what was exciting about writing that was or rather, what was exciting about it was that I had gone through a bunch of other kitchen witchcraft books previously at Catland and in other spaces, and I'd never really found anything that like held my interest or like gave me the depth and the meatiness that I was looking for. So I
Mhm.
got to kind of write this book from a place of deep frustration, the first one, where I was like, damn, kitchen witchcraft books are just not going as hard as I need them to go.
Yeah.
Why don't we have one that sort of looks at a historical tradition of kitchen witchcraft? Or why is no one giving this topic kind of the scholarship that it deserves?
Mhm.
So it's not a scholarly book, but it definitely comes from that place of like interest and nerdiness. And that definitely fueled the first one, which was great. It really felt like we accomplished something by the time that it was done, because there really isn't another book like that out there.
No, I was gonna say I think the closest one to that, and you cite it in your further reading, is Gwion Raven's book, the Magic of Food book. It talks
Yeah.
about it and that that level of, because I think about like the early, like late '80s, early '90s kitchen witchery books, and they're really just cookbooks that have this like, oh, make
Yep.
this for Beltane. They're not really talking about the ingredients. They're not talking about the why, and they're often like for like, here's banana bread, like it's not really talking about like, like how food was used in ritual or those kind of things, which I really appreciate about your book. Not to mention that your book is gorgeous. I mean, Watkins did a
Yeah.
fantastic idea. It is just a gorgeous book.
I was saying from the beginning that if Gwion Raven's book had had the photography element that mine did, I would have never needed to write my book.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel you on that. The 80s and 90s kitchen witchcraft books. Well, first of all, they're talking about kitchen witchcraft like it's this historical thing that has always existed. And like
Mm-hmm.
that was the first thing I found in my research, was that no one ever talked about themselves that way. That's
Yeah.
not a thing. Kitchen witchcraft was not different from the rest of the witchcraft. It's just the witchcraft you did with the stuff that you had in your house,
Right.
you know? And the thing that like more than just, their regular cookbooks with banana bread, the depth of the spells is like put cinnamon in your coffee and stir it widdershins for love or whatever. Things that like I'm just
I mean, if
allergic
it works, it works. That's great. But I want, like you
to.
said, I'm nerdier than that.
Exactly. But beyond that, the thing that like really like clawed at me was the fact that they're all mostly like, I don't know how else to say this, but like pagan food. And pagan food in the 80s and 90s was this like there was so much medieval revivalism in
Hmm.
neo-paganism during that period. It was very, very hot to do medieval revivalism. And medieval European food is like the worst food ever made. And so all of these like pagan food, Mabon cookies and whatever, they're all like cinnamon, dried fruit, beer, like it. I'm like, what the hell is this? So it's all like this, like citrus peels, and I'm like, bleh. So I wanted delicious
Yeah.
witchcraft, and I
Yeah.
hadn't seen that done in a way that
Hmm.
was satisfying.
Yeah.
Having a chef background helps there. It does.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's funny you said that because I was thinking about the medieval food, like stuffed peacocks. Like they didn't even go that hard. Like if they'd gone that hard, I might have. Okay.
Right?
But
I
I mean, I don't know where anyone would get a peacock today for food. I think people would
yes.
frown on
I'm
that.
grateful we're not eating
Yeah, I
them.
can't imagine, based on how bitchy they are, I can't imagine they taste good.
True facts. I never even thought about that, but that's so true. I tried to go that hard, and one of the recipes I did like a recreating a pagan feast from the Roman era, and like you want to talk about people who went hard in their feasting. The Romans were nuts.
Yeah.
Absolutely nuts. Didn't they have like vomit buckets next to the table so you can throw up and then keep eating?
So I've heard that this is actually a misunderstanding.
Oh, boo. I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Because it's funny. I went down that rabbit hole. I cannot remember. It was something I was researching for the book I'm working on now.
Oh, yeah.
And so, the vomitorium, right, was like it was like the throughway to like the Colosseum. It was like how people got into the Colosseum. So it was like vomiting people. And houses then kind of had also a vomitorium, which was like the front entrance into the main room of the house. And so they think that somehow that term with early scholarship got confused, and people, lay people had this idea that a vomitorium was like a place where you threw up, not a place that vomited people into an area.
Language is so funny that way.
Yeah.
We do really always be learning stuff.
Yeah. Well, especially like because of the passage of time, right? Like words really change over time. And I think unless you know that, it's really easy to do like these weird folk etymologies of words.
Yes. And it's like the meanings are lost and then refound over time, but then you also lose and have to refind a lot of the connotation and the metaphor and the nuance that comes with all of these terms. And that's even harder to track down and to pinpoint. I feel like so much of the work that I do is in the PGM documents. So I spent a lot of time in ancient Greek texts, and there's a lot of times where I'm going through something and I'm just like, is this gibberish or is it a pun that I don't understand? Or like something like that, the turn of phrase loses its metaphor for us. I find that a lot in like plant folklore. I'm trying to think of a random example. Mugwort used to be called felon herb. And that's people in the modern world associate that with felons, like criminals and doing crimes. And, it was it's definitely an herb associated with witchcraft. So the witchcraft criminal axis might be where that connotation comes from. It's actually an old word for like a bunion. You would call like a felon, like if you had like a lump on your thumb or your toe, it would be called a felon. And mugwort was used to treat those. But it's again, the word out of context, we don't know. And so I've seen a lot of people cite it for like criminal magics. And I'm like, no. Just warts, unfortunately.
Well, and like if you think about bunions, that's like even like bone stuff. I mean, that's a totally different. Yeah, that's really interesting. Huh. Yeah, it's so funny to me. Like I was thinking of the word fugitive because a lot of the research I'm doing right now is around the history of pigments in art.
Ooh.
And like fugitive pigments or fugitive paint. And when you talk about it that way, when you say it, like it brings this whole different content, and it's really just things that disappeared that weren't light fast or heat fast. But it's this fugitive idea that I think is really interesting, that it's used in this totally different way than we think about a fugitive.
That's such a poetic turn of phrase. I love that so much.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to try to back pocket that. I've been doing my own research on dyes and colors in occultism and magic for my second book. We just finished the manuscript a couple of weeks ago, so we're finally done on that one. But it's a kind of a departure from the first one. We're doing, it's another recipe book, but mostly about crafting with plants from an animist perspective. And there's a couple of chapters on natural dye and on inks. And so I had to go pretty hard on colors and pigments used in magic and all of that stuff. It was pretty cool, but I ended up getting stuck for way too long in like the Rosicrucians and the Golden Dawn and they're like color chambers.
Yeah, it's funny. I took this really interesting class with Alice Obscura, who I'm obsessed with.
Oh yeah,
they're in coursework, but it was a class on the history of color, basically.
Wow.
And we went through that whole arc of like, the language of color and like how humans use dye and this, this idea that the Middle Ages were all gray and brown and, just all of it was a fascinating class. It was like 4 hours over 4 weeks. And I don't know. I assume they rerun those, or I don't know if you can get replays of them, but it was
that down. That's a fun one.
fantastic. Yeah, no, it was really, really good. I'm actually trying to get the instructor to come on the show and talk about color in the occult.
Would be sick. Did they cover how in the ancient world, like blue didn't exist?
Mm-hmm. About it was like the perception of color was light and dark more than the rainbow that we think about.
Mm-hmm. The thing that I'm thinking of is I think in ancient Greece, you can sometimes find references to people calling the sky green because blue was considered like a subsidiary of green. And it's just weird to read those documents. You're like, what changed exactly? And it was just the language around color, nothing else.
Yeah. Well, and just like how it, color is different for every human, like fascinates me. Like the actual structure of our eye and our brains and how those work together means that when I look at the color of the sky, it's not the exact same shade of blue that you see.
That freaks me out. It's so wild. Yeah. I mean, so much of witchcraft, though, comes back to like the differences between my individual experience and your individual experience. You know what I mean? So I feel like thinking about that as like an occult notion, or like, I don't know, maybe this is the beginning of a thought, not like an actual thought, but like that feels so analogous to me to the ways in which like the entirety of practice and experience of the magical world is fully individual in that sense. You know what I mean? Like the way that we can both be working the same practice, the same tradition, but you will always be experiencing it slightly differently than I will.
Yeah.
Even if we're doing all the same stuff. Exactly.
Yeah. No, and I think I don't know. I feel like that's important for people to hear too, because I do think it's really easy to think, well, especially in this age of like Instagram and social media, like I'm not as witchy as that person, or I'm not going as hard as that person on my occult research or whatever. And it's like, it's not a competition. I mean, I think that part to me is complicated because I do think it's easy, especially walking into a space as a new person. You always, your taste is better developed than your actual practice when you start anything, whether that's a cult or writing or painting or whatever. Like you understand where you want to be from the beginning, or at least have an idea, but you're not there yet. You just haven't practiced long enough, or you're not as experienced enough to do that yet.
I see a lot of my students doing that, especially with social media becoming such a huge part of occultism in the last few years. Just that like a compulsory comparison between yourself and another person. And there's almost this like weird way that it keeps you from progressing forward because you feel like you're not ready to take the next step. No one who takes the next step is ever ready for it. You know what I mean? Like that's what you find out when you get to the next step, is that you were never ready. You have to just do it anyway. But I feel like there's this idea that like, because we watch others performing magic and doing their rituals and having a very public practice on social media, there's also this idea that we could replicate what they're doing. And I feel like there's a little bit of that in the fact that I put out recipe books, that the idea that magic could be fully replicatable if you were to just follow the correct steps. I feel like ceremonial magic is kind of all this whole idea that we can make magic fully replicatable if we can just get the recipe right. What I've learned through my years in my practice is that is just impossible. That's not a thing, because the central ingredient is not controlled, and that ingredient is me. That's the thing that could never be replicatable. So no matter what I do and how cool it might look on Instagram, there's no hope of me transmitting that to another person. They've got to come up with their own thing for themselves, which is probably much cooler than sitting in their room and trying to do what I'm doing. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense to me. And I think I don't know, I feel like that same idea, like in the occult space, applies to writing as well, because I think, as a writer, you know what you like to read. Like I always joke about, like, I love Neil Gaiman's books. I read them, and I'm not Neil Gaiman. And I remind myself that Neil Gaiman has said, look, only you can write your book. Like no one else can write the book that you can write, including like, don't go try and be Neil Gaiman. Just try to be you. Like,
Absolutely. Okay. I'm gonna maybe I hope this person does not listen to your podcast. Maybe they do. I don't know. Who knows? We'll see. When I first started writing books and writing articles, I was really in love with the writing of Dan Schulke. Still am. Love Dan.
Mhm.
Dan's great. Um, and he's got an incredibly flowery language style. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not as bad as Chumbly. Like Chumbly to me is like almost illegible in like the flowery offshoots and metaphors where I'm like, what are you trying to say? Just say it. But I noticed myself like sort of looking at that as like the standard for occult writing. And some of my early articles have a lot of that like forced medieval flowery tongue in it. And it's
Mhm.
so not ending up being my writing style at all. I look back on those writings and I cringe a little bit, but I can definitely see what I was trying to do, which is
Right.
looking at this and being like the hallmark of what occult books should sound like. But when it tried to come out of my mouth, it was clunky and cringy and awkward and
Mhm.
strange. Definitely had to just figure my own style out and my own like sort of like way of engaging with the material, because I feel like that's also, it's not just his like writing style personal flourish, it's also about his way of engaging with the material,
Mhm.
which is to show it in a way that's kind of nebulous and kind of poetic and kind of largely metaphorical rather than being concrete and specific. And I'm definitely someone who writes recipes, so I have to be concrete and specific all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think about that. I mean, I did a master's degree in English, and I
Mhm.
was definitely in that period of academic writing where people still like. I just remember being in a class and like making a tick mark every time someone said the word reify, because I was like, really, can we just use language that people know what we mean when we say it? Like, and so I think I've taken that slight. I don't know. I can't even think of the word I really want. It's not really like snarky, but it's like just this response to that. Like, if I'm going to try and get information across, I want people to understand it.
Yeah.
I do love flowery language. I mean, I love John Donne poetry. Like, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
I love that and I enjoy reading it for pleasure, but it's difficult to read for information.
Absolutely. But we all have that sort of tendency when we're writing to try to show off sometimes, to try to be the best that we can. I feel like that's where the 18 reifies come from. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? We're all trying to do the absolute best that we can to the point of imitating one another. So like me and you were sitting here talking about like how silly it is for others to look at us and try to, do what we do and, try to replicate what we're doing on social media. And then I know that I do that same thing.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
we talk the shit, but like it's inescapable.
It's human nature. Yeah. I think it's human nature to an extent.
I'm trying to think of who's writing I'm, subconsciously ripping off in my current book now.
I mean, I don't know that there's a way to avoid it. I mean, I feel like if you're a writer,
Mhm.
you've read so much, you kind of become a pastiche as a human.
Yes.
It's just kind of how we grow as people, is we kind of stick all these things to us that we encounter. And I don't know that that's escapable.
And maybe that comes back to like the talismanic nature of a book, that it has an intelligence of its own that sort of attaches to you after you engage with it. It becomes a
Mm-hmm.
part of your psyche, whether you want it to or not.
Yeah.
It's going to inform how you write and how you read and how you engage with literary media after that point, whether it's an occult book or not.
Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
is there a book that you feel like, or a writer that you feel like is really kind of at the root of who you are as a writer?
At the root.
I guess
Um,
they're like a main influence. I don't know. Maybe the root is a little too, that may be too deep. I don't know if we could even find it.
no, it's okay. I was like, who's at the root? And I was like, no, I read a lot of garbage too. But I think if
Same.
there's one writer that I hope I sound like sometimes, or who really kind of embodies the style that I'm trying to embody, that's Corinne Boyer, far and away. I love
Mm-hmm.
that lady so much. I've had the great pleasure of meeting her a few times at conferences. And she's got this kind of Daria persona. So like I try not to go up and be annoying. You know what I mean? Be like, I love your books. You're so great. But there was one time where like she and I were waiting on the bathroom line and a bunch of people came up and they were like, I love your books. You're so great. She was like, oh, thanks, thanks. And then they left and she looked at me and she was like, even in the bathroom. She's great. I love her so much. But her writing style is it's like flowery, but only in that she lets the stories speak for themselves. She's a great
Mhm.
storyteller, but she's
Yeah.
not unnecessarily convoluted, pretty straightforward. When she shares a recipe, we're talking like a page and a half. You know what I mean? It's not
Yeah.
going on and on and on forever. And her writing is all about the material. She hides really well in her book, and she like really makes you fall in love with the folkloric research that she does. That's the way that she shows up, is just how passionately she presents it. But herself as an artist kind of falls behind. And
Mhm.
that is how I try to write. That style of writing it feels very, it feels like the thing I'm trying to do right now. Not to be
Mhm.
like, hey, Corinne Boyer, I'm ripping you off actively, but like her writing style is very much an inspiration for me. And she does come out of the same publishing house as Dan. So it's cool that Three Hands Press has a lot of these like chumbly Dan Schulke texts that are very, and it almost feels like that same medieval revivalism we were talking about a second
Mhm.
ago, that flowery language, And then you've got people like Corinne Boyer and, oh, what's her name? Blood and Spice Bush on Instagram.
Oh, yeah, Rebecca Byer.
Rebecca Byer. She's also
Mhm.
written through Three Hands Press, and she's also a very straightforward writer.
Mhm.
Uh, so, two sides of the same occult writing coin. But I'm
Yeah.
definitely on the more practical bit
Yeah, I
myself.
really enjoy Rebecca's writing a lot too. Like I think she doesn't hide as much in her writing. Like you really get a lot of Rebecca's personality, I think, in her
You
writing.
do.
But she's been on the show, and I described her book as like it's kind of like walking through the woods with a friend. Like the way she talks in her writing, like you kind of get like you're there with her as she's like having joy over this plant or something.
Yes.
So
So much of that. Yeah. And even her social media presence very much feels that way. You're
mhm.
very much brought into her world.
Yeah,
She's a great writer, great artist. Love that one.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's just so much good stuff out there right now. I feel like we just kind of have an embarrassment of riches of good stuff. I mean, there's a lot altogether, but there's also a lot of really good stuff out there right now.
Yeah. So we were talking about this a little bit before the show began, but I've been at the helm of Catland for the last like 8 years. And to be in occult books publishing and occult book selling during the last 8 years ruled. It has been such a glorious era for occult books publishing, and fine occult books publishing like Scarlet Imprint, Ouroboros Press, Hadean Press, like everyone just really bringing the most. Occult book scholarship in the last 10 years has been bananas. I feel it kind of winding down a little bit right now. And I'm sure that's just global recession. Like
Mm-hmm.
printing costs are nuts. It is what it is.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe the popular interest in occultism is finally on that downswing, which is fine. It'll come back in 10 years. It always does.
Yeah.
But to be around and watching new occult books come out for the last 10 years has been incredibly stimulating. We really have gotten some incredible scholarship and like really fun new research, new takes on old themes,
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff from the 80s and 90s being revisited from a modern lens. And
Mm-hmm.
now here where we're in a place where we're able to do so much deeper research. Like I feel like the layperson is able to do so much deeper research now through just like the online libraries that we have,
Mm-hmm.
um, much more than the 80s and 90s and previous eras. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So we have just a lot more occult scholars on the market with their unique takes and their, niche interests. I love it so much. It's been a
Mm-hmm.
great time to be in occult books.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think you're right about that wave too. Like there's always like the vanguard that stays, and then there's the new. And I mean, social media is I think really propelled a lot of the new stuff. Although I'm not saying I started the podcast in reaction to the don't read books TikTok occult garbage that was happening,
Wait, what?
but there was like this whole like don't trust books, like here are writers to avoid kind of thing. It was very brief, and I'm not I'm not really on TikTok. I have an account that I occasionally go look at, but I don't really do TikTok very much. But and I think it was coming from this place of, oh, the only books that they had seen were like books from the 80s and 90s. And I was like, yeah, we've come a long way. You should look at new books.
Look at new books, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I'm not on TikTok. I mean, you and I are. I don't mean this in a bad way. We're old for TikTok. We're not 12.
Yeah.
I can't dance like that. I'm not going to. TikTok I find very loud, so I'm not on there much myself. But and I do see that kind of reaction from younger people who are getting into occultism, who are really, really frustrated with the amount of like true garbage that you have to wade through to get to good quality information. And maybe they feel like this is more prevalent in the occult world than other industries, but it's not.
No.
In archaeology, in biology, in any sort of subject where there are facts and then made up information, you've got to slog through both to figure out what's real and maybe hopefully come to some conclusion, maybe not. Maybe there's more of like garbage books in occultism because for years, occult book publishers have just let people write whatever they want. I would go through Llewellyn catalogs with my business partners to try to figure out what books to bring on. And we'd see things on like, find your ancestral dragon magic and what kind of claws did those dragons have? And I'm like, this is why people think our subject is nonsense. Got it. It's Dungeons and Dragons all over again. And then there's like the Raven Grimassi books, which are just like a man made it up and called it Italian. So there's a lot of like annoying history to choose from and to bite through. But if you know where to look, if you know how to find like good quality occult books publishers, you can avoid all of that. And that was like a kind of the best part of being at Catland is being the occult librarian who watch people come in and go, so all the books are shit, right? And I go, no, have you checked this shelf where the books are not shit? To help people find, like to connect people with good quality occult information. That felt like the most important job for the last 10 years. That's the thing.
And I feel like the big occult publishers in the US, like I feel like Weiser and Llewellyn have upped their game in the last few years too.
For sure.
Like, I think it's been really interesting to watch, especially having the podcast and talking to a lot of new authors. It's like, oh, wow, I don't know that this would have gotten published 15 years ago with this publisher. Or, I just feel like things are really, I think everybody's kind of leveled up a little bit, which is really nice to see. There's still like a new agey aspect to things that I don't want to yuck anybody's yum. If that's your thing, and it works for you and makes your life better, great. I have a hard time with kind of the spiritual bypassing aspect of a lot of new age stuff. But I get it. If that works for you, I'm not, if you're not ready to have a deeper conversation or if you're not ready to whatever, whatever it is that appeals to you, go for it. But, and that's always going to be out there and those sell.
That's the problem.
And so I get it. Like maybe it's like romance. I'm not yucking on romance because I love it and I read a lot of trash. But, it basically props up the rest of the publishing industry because it sells, and
it's so true. I'm a triple air sign, so I love to yuck the yum. I am a hater extraordinaire. There's so many Gemini placements. I love to hate.
I'm a stellium in Libra.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So everyone who owns Catland has a Libra moon. We learned this and everyone who has ever owned Catland has had a Libra moon. So I don't know what that says about us, but it's
interesting.
Gemini placements that really make me quite mean. Not mean, critical. And so I understand that like the chalk rubs, yoni eggs, crystal books, all and the new age nonsense. Put 3 drops of lavender oil on your crystal, put it on your windowsill, and your man will come home. All that stuff. It does sell, but it sells this like flattened image of witchcraft that I'm fine with lay people having. You know what I mean? It acts as kind of a useful fence. I remember a few years ago, I feel like there was a Medium article, or maybe it was Bustle or something else, where this woman was like, I tried all the spells in a witchcraft book and none of them worked. So witchcraft is bunk. And I was like, yes, the young scientist at work. Please, what book did you pick? And it was just nonsense. It was like Intro Guide to Love Magic, Baby Witches Love Magic book from Llewellyn, 1995. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Bless
them. And I feel like if you have a genuine interest in occultism, it's not hard to find the good stuff. If you're committed to having answers served to you, you will continue to buy garbage books. A lot of it is like, unfortunately, the barrier to entry in occultism is you have to like to read. I hate that is true, but it's so true. You have to really get into reading. If you do not like to read, the information will remain locked away for you.
And a lot of the stuff, some of the English translations of like the Greek magical papyri and the Picatrix and stuff like that, some of those are pretty easy to read. But some of them aren't, because some of those translations are still pretty old themselves. Like a lot of the English translations are still pretty old. So if you're not comfortable with like kind of archaic English and just, like you said, it's like, sometimes it's like walking through mud if it's not something that you can pick up easily. So I
Oh,
get it.
yeah.
And I appreciate, scholars that are doing new translations of stuff that just make it easier for people who are not going to learn to read ancient Greek or not going to learn Arabic. They're not going to learn these things to do it. And I get it. And like, I really think sometimes about like, you know, early modern scholars and even up until like the 1800s where people just knew how to read Greek and Latin. They just learned.
Yeah, I've been reading some older books on like Greek divination, and they'll be like, oh yeah, and in the text, and they'll have a quote, and the quote is in Greek. And I'm like, there's no footnote. I just have to look up these words.
Yeah.
Like, but that's how it used to be. For me, the hardest bit is Victorian books on magic. Like late 1800s, early 1900s, Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley. It's in a different language. I cannot do that stuff. That to me is like clunky to the point of illegibility. And so I read a lot of like summaries of Crowley's work. And I read a lot of like, please don't make me engage with the text that I am allergic to. Books on that time period.
Yeah, I've been trying to read some Weight, and it is like, yeah, it's just like, okay, I get you could have said this 4 pages in like 4 lines.
Oh my God, the pictorial key to the tarot is basically Finnegan's Wake. I'm like, this is impossible. I remember being 14 years old, cracking my mother's copy of the pictorial key and being like, how do you know? I'm thinking she's got magic powers. I'm like, oh, she can read the symbolic cryptic text. And now I sold it in the store all the time, and people would go to buy it as like their first tarot book. And I'd be like, respectfully, may I make a recommendation? That's the one you've seen on the computer, but it is not the one you want. And I just always tell them to sit down on the bench and read a page. And then if they'd like a different recommendation, they could come let me know. But they always do.
No, I mean, it's smart. And I think that is one of the things that, occult spaces like occult bookstores and things like that create, like kind of like mini mentorships that if you don't have access to that can be really difficult because they're hard to find online.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And I also feel like I would even go back as far as like 80s and 90s occult waves, but there's been just this great move to sort of like reduce gatekeeping in the occult books industry, make everything kind of a little bit more accessible. Because I feel like for most of human history, in order to read occult books, not to practice witchcraft, of course, but in order to engage with occult texts, it was assumed that you were a learned person, that you had some level of scholarship. And I feel like that continues as a trend like way up until like the 50s and 60s. You know what I mean? And when we look at occult books, even just books on occultism from the early 20th century, it's inaccessible to the layperson. So that's like the most banging part of being in occult books publishing for the last few decades is we're seeing all of this super heady scholarly material on occultism being put in the common tongue. And I love that. That is my favorite part of like what has changed in occult books publishing recently.
Yeah. Yeah, I do love that. And I was thinking like, one of my goals this year was to read Gerald Gardner's novel.
Oh,
I've started it 4 times. It's not Witchcraft Today, it's the other one. But I've started it 4 times and I just can't stick with it.
What year was that? That's in the inscrutable period.
It's early 50s. It's like,
I was going to say
like
that's 58
or 59. It's pretty early. But again, I think, he was born in the late Victorian era, and I'm sure was educated in that Victorian register, and, worked in diplomacy and all that, was in Burma and all that. And so I think, it's just like that register of language is difficult to process, especially in like what is ostensibly nonfiction writing as a novel. Like it's even more like there's so many layers to it, and you're just like, this is not. It's not fun to read.
No, it's not. It's really difficult. It feels like running drills to read it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I have to do all the footnotes and the marginalia and everything to like just keep track. So I do a lot of like reading summaries of those kinds of books, or like a podcast about it, or I'll go through the text like to find specific information, but I don't engage with the entirety of the text.
Yeah.
You know, just raw dogging it. I won't
it's
be
just
doing
hard.
that.
It's just hard. And it's time consuming when you have other stuff to do. It's not like a quick, easy read. And I mean, I always try to do like a palate cleanser between these things. Like, you know, some queer romance, something in between.
Yeah, I'll do a folk tale in between.
Yeah,
sure.
you know, something. And it's just like, whoo, yeah. Brain, almost like academic brain freeze, because you're like, what is going on here?
But I feel like I've seen this move in like modern times to like a lot more short form scholarly occult writing. Like I'm thinking Hadean Press has that great series, The Guides to the Underworld. They're like,
yeah, I love those.
They're like, they're $2, which is dope. And they're just like, oh, we had like one of the foremost occult scholars. We had Jake fucking Stratton Kent write like Baby's Intro to Goetia, and it's 10 pages long. Here you go.
Yeah.
That is the answer to everyone's Victorian headache. Yeah, it's the antidote that we have been looking for to the way that occult books have been written for centuries. So it's just a cool time to be around seeing that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? I love it.
Well, and I think one of the things, especially about that series, I love too, is I think it's S. Alderney. There's one on like the fumigations of the planets.
I knew
like
you
on the
somehow
incense.
I knew you were going to bring up that one because that's my favorite one. The fumigation.
Yeah, it's so good. And I love that they're like, look, you're not going to be able to get this ingredient. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Also, it's bull eyes. So like you don't want to get this
don't want this ingredient. So here's what I've done to replicate this, which I think is freeing. And then it's like, oh, I don't have to go find bull's eyes or, you know, wood aloes because I'm not made of gold. You know, like whatever, like I'm not going to be able to get these things. So here's what you can do, you know, take the meaning from this text and replicate it. And I think it goes back to what you said about there's no way to like communicate directly. This is going to work exactly for you as it worked for me. Your mileage is always going to vary because you are the variable.
Yes, absolutely. And I was talking about that with my friend, Arnie, Eric Arneson. I just call him Arnie. We were on his show, actually, Arnemancy, talking about updating ancient magic for a modern audience and like all the ideas people have about how that's supposed to work and the difference between revivalism and reconstructionism. And I feel like that discourse to be had, you know, among non-scholars is awesome. That's something that we can only really have through these accessible short form scholarly pieces like Fumigation of the Seven Planets, where we're even talking like to interact with Agrippa's book and to bring up with an audience like we might need to make adjustments because we live in a modern world rather than I feel like what's been pushed for decades, which is we must replicate these ancient magics exactly if we want to achieve the proper result. I was talking about that with my friend Zoe, who's one of the girls in my coven. We were talking a lot about pronunciation of the sacred vowels and sacred names in ancient Greek magic and right pronunciation and how that's emphasized a lot in those circles or like in scholarly circles where, you know, you're meant to pronounce things exactly as they would have in ancient Greek. So there's a lot of fuss about vowel sounds and that. And Zoe was like, except that they had regional accents and that Greece was like a colonial empire. So if you were in the Balkans, which is where my family's from, you probably pronounce these words a little differently than you did in other places. So through like making the scholarship accessible, we're also putting people back in touch with the idea that magic exists in the hegemony. Yes, it exists in the dogma, but it also exists boots on the ground. And that's where it really comes alive.
Yeah.
And I feel like we don't have that when we're only engaging with like heady scholarly media.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about this and I'm trying to remember, like, unfortunately, now I've talked to enough people on the podcast, I'm starting to have source amnesia. But I think it was when I was talking to Christopher Hughes about, it was either Christopher Hughes or Ben Stimson, and their work kind of aligns a little bit. So I can kind of see why I'm a little frustrated with who said it. But that basically when you're talking, I think it might have been Ben Stimson, when you're talking about folklore, especially, as soon as you write it down, it dies a little bit. And that's kind of that way with these magical texts is like we've set it in stone, so to speak, in this text. And it's easy to approach it and say, oh, then it must be this thing. but how many different manuscripts are of this text and how many variations are in those manuscripts? What is the true thing? Well, we don't know. And like you said, people had regional accents. We don't have any recordings of ancient people speaking. Like there is no way, though I appreciate Reconstructionism because I get the scholarly, nerdy piece of it and wanting to have this real connection to the past.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure that it's ever going to be 100% possible. It's just not. The past
Completely.
is a foreign country. That's real. So
The past is completely locked away from us. And also, like, again, back to that piece about the irreplicability. Like, even if we knew the vowel sounds, I'm of a completely different experience than any of those people. I'm of a completely different worldview and cosmology than any of those people. Even if I try to reconstruct as much as I can, I'm still the variable ingredient that's different.
Right.
This is the hardest part to like share with new baby witches. And it's like, it's the truth that I have learned in my occult journey that like has ripped my skin off and put it back on is that there is no truth. There is only the individual experience. There is only you and your personal craft engaging with the world. And if you're looking for a bigger truth, a bigger right way to do magic, the correct key that unlocks the door, you're going to be so disappointed.
And you're going to spend a lot of money. And you're going to spend a lot of money.
And you're going to spend a lot of time in the armchair, which is like the most unhelpful place for you to be, searching for the right thing before you ever actually take the step out the door.
Yeah.
How lame is that?
Well, and I think one of the things I think is interesting because I've said this on the podcast several times. I'm 50, and I came.
What is your moisturizer?
Well, there's a tiny filter on Zoom, by the way.
Oh.
But I'm actually just a vampire with the sun. I think that's really the key. But I came to witchcraft through kind of like women's spirituality. I mean, my family always kind of had some interesting new agey stuff going on. Like, I know we had those Time Life mystery books when I was a kid, and that sucked me in and all that. And then when I got to college, I found these other women who were doing witchcraft things, but they weren't really calling it that yet. It was still this kind of women's spirituality, which I think now looking back on it, probably had a lot of reclaiming mixed in with it. And, I really, it was what I needed at the time. It was a good place to land, but it never was what I wanted. It just became really quickly not what I wanted. And I think, for new people coming in, like, it's just so important to realize that it is your own journey and your experience. And if your magic that works for you is, intentionality based and like putting cinnamon in your coffee or whatever, and that works for you and that's where you're happy, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I don't think you have to compare yourself, but if you are going to nerd out, then go hard, then do it.
Absolutely. I think that the one thing that I would say is to caution people about feeling like they've arrived at a definition of what witchcraft is. I definitely did that when I was like new in magic, and I read like 2 Lon Milo Duquette books, and I was like, I have the secret, and formed a worldview of what magic is that like crumbled pretty quickly. The more you learn, the more it's going to keep breaking and rebuilding and keep breaking and rebuilding. As long as you're still doing that, you're still doing magic. When we arrive at like, this is it, I shall go no further. I have found the thing, no need to search. That's when red flags go up for me. And that's when I would like poke a reader a little bit harder. You know what I mean?
Like what is that? Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know. I think that's kind of a sign of maturity that you realize that when you get to whatever you thought the pinnacle was and you're standing there and you're like, oh, nobody else really knows what they're doing either. And then you realize that you're not on the pinnacle. Like there's like 1,000 of them above you.
It's more like a range of hills than it is a pinnacle anywhere. And you're just going to kind of figure out which hill you'd like to be closest to, That is like the greatest hope we can have for finding truth, big air quotes, truth in magic.
And probably anything else, honestly.
But I guess in the beginning, you do have to try to do something. And so comparing yourself to someone else or following someone else's lead is helpful in some ways. You got to break away from that as soon as you can, though.
Yeah. No, I think it's true. And so, all right, we've talked a lot about like the theory, I guess, of that, but like I want to make sure that we talk about you as a writer too. And so, like, what for you like what is the drive to write? Like, is it the research and getting it out there? Is it like what does it mean for you to be a writer?
Great question. I mean, so again, triple air sign. The research is happening constantly. The research is happening at 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep and I find a footnote and I need to know what it's about. You know, that's how my brain works. 800 tabs open at all times. Like that's happening whether or not the books come out. And so it's not so much about actualizing that. I think I'm really, really interested in making witchcraft accessible. In taking a lot of these heady ideas, and I want to make better beginner witchcraft books. And that might not be like the loftiest goal. You know, from being in the publishing world for so long, there's definitely like the people who are big in occult books publishing in the scholarly world, and everyone wants to be the next big scholar, you know, out from the such and such big occult publishing company. And so it feels like kind of a sellout cop out to be focusing on introductory books. It almost feels like I'm not doing as much as I could be by not putting out better researched, more scholarly books through more well-respected publishers. Absolutely no disrespect to Watkins. They are the oldest occult book publisher in London. They're mine and they rule. But I feel like this work doesn't get respected as much as other work because it's intro level. But what I'm trying to do from years of being on that front desk at Catland and just seeing the swill that passes for intro witchcraft books. Sorry to all authors who write them, but you know, it's not good. I want people who are just getting into magic to be able to interact with historical information, something that's just beyond the new age, directly, you know, engaging with spirits, directly engaging with cosmologies of magic that are bigger than what you get in the other books that exist. I really want to write better introduction books for people that set them up to be intellectually curious about magic and to be testing the information that they're receiving, that make critical readers in occultism, where I'll cite my sources and I will interact with like old occult books that seem really, really formidable to new readers, but like present cool ideas and have them do recipes from them. You know what I mean? That's the drive for me. And it's not like the loftiest goal, but it's not an ego-driven one. It's very much one that like serves the community. That's been my role and my goal for so long. I can't put that down. And this is the need that I see the biggest in the occult world is just high quality introduction books to occultism. And there's a few people who are writing them. You know, Sarah Lyons just wrote How to Study Magic. That book rules. A couple of my other friends have put out good books that are introduction level. Like we were just talking about Rebecca Byer. Great book on foraging and magic. If you were an intro or a beginner witch and you picked that one up as your first book, you'd be in a great position. You know what I mean? It's just a lot deeper than the ones that we've had for 10, 20, 30 years. So that's my drive is I want people to be empowered as beginner students of the occult. Because that's such a disempowering place to be in. And there's a lot of people who make money by selling beginner witches junk. And I want to do what I can to undercut them.
Yeah. I think I interviewed the artist formerly known as Firelight, Don Martin, early on in the podcast.
Wow.
And him talking about that same idea that, you know, if you're going to walk through this door, know that there are people on the other side that really just want to separate you from your money and your power.
Yeah, you know, this industry more than others has a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Scammers. Yeah, and it's so easy to scam in this industry. And you know, when I engage with lay people and I tell them what I do for a living, a lot of them automatically assume that that's what I do. I've got a good friend, Albert. His stage name is Albert Cadabra. He's in Sideshow and Magic. And when I first met him and told him I was a tarot reader, he's used to carnival tarot readers who are not real magical practitioners. They're there to separate you from your money and quickly. And so he assumed that that's what I do and that I run a business based on scamming people. And initially we didn't like each other very much. But it's like, I don't know how you prepare people for that. Especially at Catland, where I'm also trying to sell them books. It's hard to be like, no, but like, I'm here to help you. And that person is there to scam you. And with social media, it's so much easier to become and create a cult of personality that may or may not have anything like sort of valid
Huh.
or meaty behind it. This industry in particular, it's so dangerous in that regard. There's just a lot. The scamming is real. You know.
Yeah. I,
Go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting talking to some. I mean, like I've talked to a lot of folks who are public witches, like in the social media sense. But I mean, you've been a public occultist in an occult bookstore in New York City. So, like, how do you think that experience has, like affected your writing and who you are as an occult person, just being in that context?
Hmm. It's given me no tolerance for the schmooze. You know what I mean? I've been schmoozed by the best. We've had everyone from every level of fame come through and teach at our shop, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested in the quality over the followership.
Mm-hmm.
I've been very disappointed by people who are quite famous who have come through the shop before. I won't name names, but I've had people like snap their fingers at me and demand water and stuff like that. Yeah. I've also had like absolute clowns come in and demand like hours and hours and hours of our time and our business, for their own little brand that, you know, is mostly built on nothing. So I think that it's given me a panoptic view of the industry, which
Mm-hmm.
is, it's not good to see how the sausage is made.
No,
There's
not
a
usually.
lot of that in running an occult bookstore. Unfortunately, you see a lot of that. But it's also shown me what is actually out there, which is great. So when I find a gem, I like lift it up to the light. I like show everyone their work. And it's given me a platform where I get to be really picky and choosy about like what kind of information I elevate. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm very particular about like really amplifying the voices of people who are doing the work and being really, really quiet about folks who aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. That's maybe like a more petty and drama filled answer than like people wanted, but no, it's true. Like to be able to see how much of that scamination happens, even from people who are perceived as very legitimate, who are authors, who have their own brands and stuff like that. Um, it's made me very selective about what I trust and what I give my attention to in the occult world. And I feel like that's been flooded with a lot of noise through social media and stuff in the last few years, which is great because that same attention also promotes good scholarship and like
Mm-hmm.
gets more good occult books published. So like we're happy it's happening. But and I feel like that has made my work much more focused on authenticity, on transparency,
Mm-hmm.
and on fostering people who are new, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's how it's informed my work and my writing and the entirety of my brand mostly is when you learn exactly what this industry is like and how the money is made and where it's going, uh, and sort of the ethical quandaries of that.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. It's given me a razor sharp bullshit detector.
Yeah, which I mean, for those of us who are not New Yorkers, it's easy to think New Yorkers have those built in anyway. So,
Fair. I always forget. Yeah. I'm also in like the city of scam. You know what I mean?
mm,
Behind Las
yeah,
Vegas, like it's New York. So
yeah,
we have it built into some capacity, but the occult world really gave it to me all over again.
hmm
The people that I thought were legitimate when I first got into this business are not on my radar now.
yeah,
And there's so many small voices in this industry that really deserve a lot more attention, a lot more amplification, that are doing really, really cool and novel things with witchcraft.
mm,
And that's the side that I want to be on. That's the side that I want to be amplifying. So seeing that panoptic view of the industry was like disheartening and cringy on one hand, and also really inspiring and engaging on the other.
yeah,
And it's shown me that, like any other industry, you just have to kind of know where to look.
yeah. No, I think that's really true. Oh,
Mhm.
well, we try to keep it to an hour, although I know you and I are going over, but that's
I
okay.
know.
No, because this has been a fascinating conversation. But I wanted to make sure I gave you opportunity to plug kind of what's coming for you since you got a new
Sure,
book
yeah.
coming out that I'm super excited about, by the way. So yeah, this will come out like kind of into November. So like what's new for you? I mean, you've had some big news recently.
I have.
Um,
So the big news in my world is that my brick and mortar shop is shuttering. And that's okay. You know, where Catland is going to continue to exist in an online capacity. And this world and like our global economy is not really built to foster brick and mortar spaces anymore. We're doing recession meets housing crisis, rent crisis, all of that happening at once. we're in the collapse of Western society. And so I feel like this is the symptoms of that. Luckily, the online world is still pretty democratized and it's still very accessible. So we'll be living in that space. And as far as my personal work, it's lived in the online world for a long time, mostly in an interest of just making the information accessible to lots of different people. So I just finished writing and production on my second book. Big stuff. We turned in all of the photography and the manuscript just a couple of weeks ago. So it'll be ready by Beltane of next year, I think is our release date. So it's going to be exciting. We're talking a lot about crafting and working with plants in this book. My first book was The Kitchen Witchcraft, which is great, but I left the food service industry for a reason. I love cooking privately. So it's nice to be focusing a little bit more in the second book on the work that I am actively sharing with the community. I've run a little Etsy shop under the name Moon Cult Herbs for years. And so now I'm able to sort of take the corpus of information and research that has, really built the foundation of that and share that interesting stuff with the world. So happy to be doing that. As far as other stuff that's on my agenda, we did launch a Patreon this last year. I'm learning how to use a computer is really what's happening. Despite all of my air signs, I'm not good at that. I'm definitely bog witch in the tent. I know how to light a fire very quickly, but I don't know how to run a Substack. So I can forage. I can't send an email. So that's my brain. So I've been learning how to use the computer, and Patreon has been really fun for that. It's great to share, research with an audience that's hungry for it, especially my more niche research, like my bread spells classes and stuff like that. That's been the dopest. I also am teaching a bunch this upcoming year. I'm, continuing to grow the Etsy, and I'm just going to kind of be nooking off in my corner of the occult social media nonsense circus world. Just kind of keep doing my thing. Cool. I've been, working on some new classes, nothing crazy. It's been a wacky few years, post-pandemic in the occult world. And I feel like I'm seeing a lot of publishers kind of quiet down. I'm seeing a lot of corners of the occult world begin to become a little bit more quiet. I'm just kind of doing my thing for a bit.
Yeah, no, I like that. So I'll have links to Patreon and all that stuff in the show notes for folks. And then we get to play our game of chance. So we talked a little bit about astrology earlier, and I always joke that as a Scorpio sun, I don't know how to do small talk. That's not how my brain is wired. So I'm going to roll a die, and depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. Those things, that people aren't supposed to talk about in, on first dates or whatever.
First podcast.
Yeah. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick what you want. So okay. So for politics, there are no rules to this game too. And if you want a different one, you can also say that.
Okay.
You're good for politics?
Yeah. And 4 is my favorite number. So let's go.
Oh, well, good. Okay. So I've asked a lot of guests on the show, when we get to this part of the thing about what political duties, witches and practitioners have, in the world. But because of your first book, I wanted to ask you that as kind of a scant of that is what do you think people who are either kitchen witches or people who are in food in some way, what political responsibilities do they have magically? Because I think there's another layer there.
Okay. Very juicy question. I like that. When it comes to witchcraft and politics, the first thing that comes to my mind is that I understand witchcraft as a practice of engagement with the non-human world. So to me, witchcraft is not a human-centric practice. It's not associated with human society. And so it doesn't make the insistence that politics does, that we must be in and of the human world and serving the human world at all times. So it makes a departure there. However, a lot of my books are also written from the animist perspective. So our witchcraft is grounded in relating to the spirits and the non-human beings and intelligences of the world around us. And it only works because we're able to use those relationships and forge those allyships. And that's really what turns the wheel of our magic and gets the motor running. So when you look at that through a kitchen witchcraft perspective, especially for this time period we're in right now, most of us are not actually engaging with how our food is grown, sort of the telos of our food, where it comes from, how the sausage is made is apparently all we're going to talk about today. So we're really so far cut off from that. And with that, sort of ignorance, we get into a lot of food industry injustice, the way that the food industry keeps humans enslaved across the world, keeps animals enslaved across the world, contributes to large scale ecological destruction, deforestation, all of that. And that's when our interest in this witchcraft becomes political. So if our allyships and our relationships to these spirits of the land are genuine, we have an obligation to do what we can to maintain, our ethics in those relationships. If I've got a friend who I know is being attacked politically, or being attacked, or there's a political candidate that's making their life more difficult. I'm thinking about like what the Trump administration has done for LGBTQ folks in this country, if I'm aware of something like that happening to a person or a population that I care about, it's my obligation to at least do my best to not contribute to, those things. So it makes our responsibilities as ecological protectors much more prominent. It makes the decisions that we make much weightier because there are people or spirits or intelligences that we care about who may or may not suffer consequences. So it makes our obligation to make decisions in our politics much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Beyond weighty, much more meaningful, much more integral to the functionality of our practice. Not just that it's important, but that it makes your magic go. You can't have magic when you have like inconsistencies of the mind, when you've got cognitive dissonance, when you're acting one way or believing one way and then acting another. The magic ceases to function in the sort of seamless way that it should. So if our magic has integrity and we, take the principles that we believe in spiritually and we apply them to the political sphere, to our political actions, then we have a lot more integrity of practice and integrity of self. So that's where it becomes important. Kitchen witchcraft is often, I think, spoken about as like this cute thing that you just do at home, but people forget that the kitchen doesn't stop at the door. It's not just the hearth. The kitchen is food creation, is human interaction with the land. It goes farther and deeper than your own personal life. And that's where it becomes political, if that makes sense.
No, totally makes sense. And I think, you've been in the food industry too. I mean, we didn't really even talk about this, but both have that in common, that we've both been in the food industry. I worked in restaurants and hotels, and I taught culinary school, and like I've seen up close and personal what that looks like, just on the human scale of just that aspect of, our food thing. And then I also think personally about like, if I'm not, one of the things that I have not really taken from ancient texts, and this is probably going to make people think a way about me, but like this long deprivation of like, the purifying kind of things. Like, I mean, yes, I'll take a cleansing bath, those kind of things, but I'm not going to fast for a week because I would pass out, like those kind of things are going to happen for me. And so I think a lot about like what other ways just like what we take in feed our magic, not just our bodies. And I think that it's really easy to cross a line there into some elitist goop bullshit.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, who was it? I was just listening to a podcast with Frater Ocker and the gentleman who just wrote the new book with him that I can't remember his name. Oh, God.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I can't think of his name.
We'll find it later. We'll put it in the notes. But he's actually a gentleman who is a wheelchair user. And he was talking about ableism in occultism. And in particular, they're doing like ceremonial ritual magic. And that's stuff where you got to like be getting up and walking around and stuff. And he's like, so I just am not doing it. Is that the plan? Like people in wheelchairs just can't be doing this. So like people who have dietary restrictions can't be doing certain forms of magic. People who can't fast can't be doing magic. Like there, a lot of that stuff is kind of, we were talking about this earlier about the emphasis on doing something right and creating like a perfect structure of ritual that is correct. Often leaves a lot of people out and leaves a lot of experiences out. So there's definitely been this dogmatic way of relating to food as magical materia that we've had for like, I don't know, since kitchen witchcraft, big air quotes, became a thing in the 50s and 60s, that I think is needing some revision now that we're at a place where like dietary restrictions are a lot more mainstream. Food allergies are becoming more and more common every single year. And the way that we interact with food as a culture and as a society is changing and also needs to change further. And if we want to keep having food, for sure, for sure. And those things bleed over into using that materia magica in our witchcraft as well.
Yeah. Oh, good stuff all around. Yeah. I feel like you and I could probably have like a whole podcast series talking about these issues.
Oh, yeah.
Like, yeah. So what is that? You can't start just one podcast. But hopefully we will just talk about it more when your next book comes out.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to come back. There will definitely be a lot to talk about next Beltane when the Witches' Workshop finally arrives.
Yeah, well, let's do it. And until then, let's keep in touch.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yay.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. Sue Fertal edits our transcripts, which are available with all of our previous episodes at witchlitpod.com. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.